Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Eddie.
And
Hey, guys.
All right, well, I wanted to give everyone time to sign on from the previous meeting, but if everyone's here, I'll go ahead and get started. All the folks from DND. Okay.
I think we might want to let there's some BPDA folks in as well.
Yeah, okay.
And then I know we've got some advocates who are going to comment as well.
So Lauren and Michelle, and anyone else? Vineet Gupta, he's from the city.
Yes, transportation.
Yeah, okay. Are they in or are they
No.
voting into panel? Sorry, I was giving them permission to talk. I meant to promote them to panelists, sorry. Okay. All right, it's 10:10. All right, we'll just go ahead and get started. 1 second. Let's pull up my notes. Yeah, right. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lydia Edwards. Today is it's Tuesday, June 22nd, and this is a hearing on docket 0685, an order regarding a text amendment to the Boston zoning code with respect to parking minimums for affordable housing. It was referred to the committee on May 19, 2021. The sponsors of this docket are Councilor Kenzie Bach and Councilor Matt O'Malley. This, again, in accordance with Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law. The City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually via Zoom, and it allows us to, again, continue to balance our ability to do our jobs with the public health somewhat recovery of the moment. So the public may watch this hearing via live stream at boston.gov/city-council-tv and live at Xfinity 8, RCN 2, and Verizon 964. It would also be rebroadcasted at a later date. Written comments may be sent to ccc.go@boston.gov and we made part of the record and available to all counselors. I'm going to turn it over to the counselors now for some very brief opening statements, starting with the lead sponsors, and then I think we're going to go to the public and then the administration, at least according to my run of show I received. So if that's not your understanding, Councilor Bach can go ahead and text a different one. Just to acknowledge who's here, Councilor Bach, Councilor O'Malley, who are the lead sponsors, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Mejia, Councilor Wu, and myself, the chair. Am I missing any counselors? Okay, so I'm going to turn over to lead sponsors.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilor Edwards. And thank you for holding this working session in the midst of, I feel slightly hypocritical because it's budget season and I have generally been trying to encourage folks to do things at other times. But what prompted Councilor O'Malley and I to file this was really an emergency that we're having. It's a set of linked emergencies. It's the, affordable housing crisis that we're in the city. And then I think lots of us are talking about and worrying about mass and CAS and a bunch of, interrelated crises where the solution often is housing with supportive services. And we've repeatedly seen now in the last 6 months in the city housing with supportive services, housing for formerly homeless folks, and now most recently some housing for seniors in Councilor O'Malley's district. And I'll let him speak to the particulars there more. Be blocked by a kind of cynical legal strategy that's based on the fact that we have parking minimums associated with these affordable housing developments, even affordable housing developments where everybody who knows the industry and the residents knows that that it doesn't really make sense to have that many parking spots. And so we go through the process to exempt them from that, and then it creates a hook for these legal challenges. And I think that there's a broader conversation to be had about parking minimums in the city, but specifically with this, where we're tackling this crisis and where we're seeing these lawsuits, I think that the need to follow some of the state action in the housing choice bill last year and really try to remove some of those hooks for those kinds of lawsuits is just critical to achieving our policy goals here. So Councilor O'Malley and I had been working on a broader set of things to think about how to expedite affordable housing development in the city. And I think those conversations about our Article 80 review process and other things will need to continue. But this feels like a piece to really bite off and chew now so that we can help get these really worthy projects through. And that's the spirit in which this has been offered. And it's the spirit in which I'm grateful to you for holding this as a working session today. And to the administration, which I know is bringing some technical comments, and many of the advocates who are joining us as well today who have kind of firsthand experience of what these requirements cash out to on the ground and the way that they can delay and add expense to our affordable housing projects. So grateful to you and to my co-sponsor, Councilor O'Malley.
Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, friends and colleagues. Thank you, of course, to the chair for this quick hearing, and to my dear colleague and friend and co-sponsor, Councilor Buck, for her leadership and partnership on this. Very simply, this is a working session, so I look forward to getting more into the level of specificity that this change deserves. But suffice it to say, I wanted to give a little background. It was last August, after a year plus of a really honest and robust and transparent community process, the Pine Street Inn, a national leader in helping folks move up and out of poverty, agreed on building a significant building, about 200 plus units in Jamaica Plain on Washington Street, close to Green Street Station, relatively close to Forest Hills, major MBTA hub, and had near universal approval of all neighbors. I had often referenced that I had never seen in 11 years, or at that point 10 years, a neighborhood project have as much support and from as many disparate voices in my time in office. Sadly, literally at the 11th hour, a business owning a butter, not someone who lives in the city, but someone who owns a business that abuts the property, sued, which is his right under our zoning laws. But among the issues that helped make up this litigation included parking minimums. This is a 100% affordable unit, obviously, or units. And it was just a needless and, in my opinion, a reckless and frivolous lawsuit that delayed housing for individuals in the midst of pandemic at a time when we need it. Sadly, less than a year after that, so going back now to, I guess, April or May of this year, the same landlord offered the same, in my opinion, frivolous lawsuit on another 100% affordable unit. This was a unit developed by the Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation, perhaps not a national leader, but certainly a regional leader. And this was senior housing, affordable senior housing, something that we desperately need in the city of Boston. And again, perhaps tied or perhaps even surpassing the Pine Street Inn project as something that had universal support. And once again, parking was used as one of the indicators or one of the rationale behind the lawsuit. It's wrong, it's unfair, and it's using these parking minimums as a weapon. And I want to be clear, what we're talking about today is 100% affordable units. We're not talking about doing away with parking restrictions for every development that comes down the pike. For these very, very small number of 100% affordable developments, parking should no longer be used, weaponized by one abutter or a business owner that abuts the property to slow progress and to slow development. There is precedence for this. This isn't the first time. These two instances in Jamaica Plain weren't the first time that this was used. Odiously, 40 plus years ago, the United States Supreme Court found that Parma, Ohio had used parking minimums as a reason to uphold housing segregation by indicating that you needed several extra spaces for multi-family units. So we've seen how this has been used negatively in the past, and our purpose today is to come up with a solution so that it will not be used erroneously or negatively in the future. So I look forward to the work. Thank again my partner. Thank you, Madam Chair, and my colleagues who are with us this morning.
Madam Chair, you're muted.
Sorry about that. We've also been joined by Councillor Baker, and I think order of arrival had Councillor Flynn next. I'm sorry, Councillor Wu. Councillor Wu, and then Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. It is rare that I precede Councillor Flynn, so it makes sense to have made that. I just wanted to say I'm so sorry I can't stay for this, but wanted to offer my support and whatever help that I can provide to the sponsors here. This is an issue that we are seeing citywide and in a time of great urgency when it comes to housing stability and making sure we're moving things along. Fully want to back this, and thank you for making sure this conversation continues.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you, Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Bach, for your important work on this issue. I agree with the comments made by my colleagues. I just want to add one slight differing opinion. Residents in my neighborhood, especially of South Boston and Chinatown, complain, rightfully so, to me every day about the lack of parking in my community. Oftentimes driving around the street or the corner, 30 minutes looking for a spot. So just want to highlight that one neighborhood might be different from another neighborhood. I certainly am a strong supporter of building affordable housing, of building public housing. I want it more in my neighborhood as much as I can get. But we also have to realize that one size may not fit all, and that some neighborhoods are desperate for more parking, and that includes some neighborhoods in my district. So again, just want to say thank you to Councillor O'Malley, Councillor Bach, and to the chair, Councillor Edwards, for their important work on this issue. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia and Councillor Baker.
Yes, good morning. Excited to have this conversation. I just wanted to start off by saying that I definitely support this initiative, but I do have a few clarifying questions to ensure that we're creating processes that not only help affordable housing development, but also help the residents who occupy these affordable units. I think that it's really important, and the more that I engage in conversations like this, the more I realize that a lot of our zoning laws are put into place oftentimes with good intentions, but the impact of those intentions really do hinder the process, if you will, to build across the city with the residents who are oftentimes forced out of their neighborhoods that they grew up in. So I think that this is a timely conversation, and I'm in full support of this. Thank you.
Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for hosting us here today. Generally in support of this measure here, but similar to Councilor Flynn, I think that we have to use some caution moving forward. Maybe not every project should be no parking. If they can fit it, they should probably have some spaces. But like I said, generally in support of. But I don't just, if there are a way that we could manage it so we wouldn't lose good projects like what happened in Jamaica Plain, that one abutter shouldn't have that sort of sway over a project like this. The benefits far outweigh the impact of the parking. And I'm not familiar with the site, but so thank you everybody for coming here today, and thank you, Madam Chair, looking to just listen in here and learn. Thank you.
Thank you. And I had misspoke earlier, in case people are confused or might be confused. This is a working session, and so we'll get into the language, but also we're going to go to the administration first, who does have some suggestions, and then go to the public or a round of questions from the counselors. Just real quick on my own part, we're in the middle of a massive development in East Boston, and the biggest concern is that we already don't plan for cars. And so the issue is just because you don't zone or require parking doesn't mean that you're actually accounting for the amount of people who are going to bring cars. It just means that this building may be adding to the continued issue of the fact that there are more cars than there are available space. And yes, I agree. I mean, you want to get ahead of frivolous lawsuits that prevent people who are really under the guise or under the pretext of it's about parking when it's really about something else. But this is an issue, and I don't know that it's going to help communities that already feel that they're on fire when it comes to overdevelopment and lack of planning. If at anything, when I brought this up to a developer who only does affordable housing, the first thing they said was, so people who need deeply affordable units or families don't get parking? Is that what you're trying to do? And so how do you say that? If you're trying to get family housing, if you're trying to get people in middle class to stay in Boston, but the buildings that they're in don't have parking requirements. I don't know too many families or people who have children who are perfectly fine and can exist without a car. So I don't know that this is striking that right balance. Again, I agree with the ultimate goal. You do not want some NIMBY person who doesn't want poor people to be near them to be able to sue their way out of having that happen. But I don't know that you can really pass this without District Article 53, which is East Boston, being included in that, or other places. But I can assure you, maybe unlike your districts, mine's on fire when it comes to development. We're done. And the parking issue is only adding gasoline to it. So we're going to turn it over now to the administration, and they can go through some points. I'm sure everyone has a copy of this language, so we can go through and get to the working session. Have I promoted all of the administration to panelist positions? Okay, all right, we'll turn it over to, I think, D&D and then BPDA.
Okay, great. Good morning, Chairperson Edwards. Good morning, counselors. Thank you for providing D&D this opportunity to comment on docket number 0685. The Department of Neighborhood Development is in support of this effort and welcomes efforts to ease the approval process for affordable housing projects. We'd like to provide the following feedback organized around 3 items. We also submitted something in writing with a line item edit to the proposed change to express our recommendations. So our first recommendation is around the required income restricted percentage. I just realized I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry, I'm Jessica Boatwright. I'm the Deputy Director for Neighborhood Housing Development at D&D. So I'll continue. So the required income restricted percentage, the draft as it is right now proposes that this amendment would only apply to projects that are 100% income restricted. We would suggest that a lower percentage be used, perhaps 60%. Lowering the threshold would allow the following project types to be included. We often have senior or supportive housing projects that may contain 1 or 2 manager or support staff units, so they would not be 100% affordable. Also, projects that are largely income restricted, but where the community has requested that some units be market rate to create a mixed income community. A really good example of this are the standards set out in Nubian Square in the Roxbury Strategic Master Plan, where 2/3 of the units are income restricted and 1/3 are market rate. So if you lower the percentage, you can include those projects. We also recommend a change in the maximum income limit used for eligible units. The proposal calls for use of the inclusionary development policy to determine which units contribute to the percentage of units that are income restricted. Currently, this policy has a maximum of 70% of area median income, AMI, for rental units and 100% of AMI for homeownership units. As the IDP income limits may change in the future and may vary by zoning districts or even within a zoning district that has a special planning area, we would recommend using area median income units that is more consistent with DND's funding sources and also HUD's funding sources. So the income limits for many of our rental funds, such as the Community Development Block Grant or the Neighborhood Housing Trust or Housing Boston 2030 money, are set at 80% of area median income, with homeownership units at 100% of area median income. So we would recommend that this maximum be set at a percentage at the 100% of area median income rather than 70%. And then finally, I just want to, really state that DND has an ongoing commitment to work with local neighborhoods on behalf of the administration. So we've long been committed to working closely with local neighborhoods throughout our land disposition and affordable housing development activities on every issue, which includes parking. So moving forward under either current or future zoning changes, we would of course continue this practice of partnering with the local neighborhoods to prioritize local issues and the neighborhood context to determine what's appropriate for each individual project. We believe that none of these changes will undermine the spirit of this initiative, as projects, even projects with 60% of income restricted units, are not viable without a public funding source. So all of these would qualify as affordable housing projects under the kind of definition and the spirit of the proposed change. I'm happy to walk through the specific recommendation in the text of the proposed change. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you for your detailed breakdown and also suggestions. You said you have a red line version. Could you please send that over to Christine.O'Donnell@boston.gov, and then she can make that available to all of the counselors.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Did you want to pass the mic to someone in DND who was planning on speaking?
I'm here on behalf of DND, so I'm going to pass it over to BPDA. It looks like Brian Glasscock is ready to talk.
Perfect. Brian?
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Mr. Council President and chairs. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this working session. This is a really tough issue. It's certainly timely. We see around the country, cities are re-examining their parking requirements. Boston's been long moving towards eliminating parking minimums, and we recognize that we have the benefit of having at least the framework of a decent transit system. Maybe if not fully operational, the framework is there, and the opportunity is there to move away from a car-centric world. Just to start off with, we discussed this internally, Councillor Edwards. We shared some of your concerns about some of the potential equity implications here. Not sure how we would approach that, because we certainly wouldn't accept housing units, affordable units in buildings with market rate units that had substandard finishes or appliances. We don't want to see people feeling like they're being somehow singled out, that they're not able to have a car if that's something they need. And a lot of working poor are working in jobs where having a car is really critical. So there is an equity question that I think we need to think through a little bit more. There's also question of we don't want to create resentment in the neighborhood for affordable units, because people will be seen as, the neighbors all know that there's a chance that people moving in are going to have cars and they'll be taking on-street parking spaces. And we don't want to create a situation where, they're coming in with this wedge already in place. And we certainly want to be mindful of that. I think that there are some opportunities for projects to go through a large project review, for instance, where the parking minimums are sort of set aside, and we're able to sort out through the transportation access plan agreement process, figure out what the right amount of parking is, because there isn't the one size fits all of parking minimums that we've had, for many, many years, doesn't necessarily play out. Certainly elderly housing, senior housing, doesn't need as much parking. Parking, people who are in recovery, for instance, transitional housing, may not need as much parking as other uses. So, it's much easier to deal with that on a case-by-case basis, and the large project review process does provide for that. I think that's we've been fairly successful at doing that in the past. One other issue that we certainly defer to DND's judgment on synchronizing the numbers for affordability. The one question we had was if we limit it to 100% of the units being affordable, for some types of projects, there may be a manager's unit or a site supervisor's unit that was not necessarily affordable, doesn't fall into that bucket. And it would be a shame if that was something that sort of knocked this out of this provision. So, we'd suggest maybe let's think a little bit about are there development, otherwise affordable developments where it's not 100%, but it's pretty close. So I'm not sure what that is. If it's 90% or whatever, that's something we want to sort through a little bit. I think the way of looking at that maybe is to look backwards at otherwise 100% affordable projects and see, are there units there that really don't exactly qualify because they're for the site supervisor or something. It's a sort of a technical point, but I think it's something we want to think about. Mostly we're here just to listen and be supportive and help work through this. It's a very important issue.
Thank you. Were there any other folks from the administration wanting to testify, provide language suggestions?
Madam Chair, I know Benita's here from BTD. I don't know if you wanted.
Benit, were you here to testify?
I think that, Brian, thank you, councillors, and thank you for having us on this important hearing. I think Brian did a really good job in summarizing many of the transportation department's issues as well. But in brief, we definitely support affordable housing. And if the cost of parking is having an impact on affordability, then we need to consider having less parking. And the second point to make here is that we have to find the right balance relative to how much parking there should be in an affordable housing development. Because as Brian mentioned, there's an equity issue, and as Councillor Edwards mentioned as well. And we want to make sure that people who need vehicular mobility have access to a car that's convenient. So it's finding the right balance, but we definitely support less parking for affordable housing.
I guess we can go through a round of councillors or points if you'd like, and then we can go to some public folks, some advocates. Is that okay, Councillor Bach O'Malley? Okay, we'll just go ahead and start with the co-sponsors, Councillor Bach, then Councillor O'Malley, then Councillor Wu had to go. We'll go to Flynn, Mejia, Baker, then myself.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. And thank you, Jessica, for those suggestions. I know we're getting the red lines over, but certainly I think that it makes sense to me. The sort of IDP reference on the affordability was really just looking for a placeholder that would be kind of give us some consistency. And I hear the point about, if we're talking about some of our things that go up to 100% AMI, like you want something that's durable, right? That doesn't like as policy changes like year to year, we're not talking about zoning amendments. Because the funny thing is when I went back and looked in the zoning code at where you would do this, what I found is that our predecessors in the 80s did this, but they described specifically like HUD senior housing with this very particular description that doesn't now apply to most things, right? So I think like we can learn from that and try to make it as capacious as possible to sort of get the spirit of the thing. So I'd consider that a friendly amendment. And, I think that the gist of this thing is, to your point, to try to think about these, what we would really characterize as affordable projects. But certainly agree that, you know, if there can be the manager unit issue. I think also sometimes, like you're saying, there might be a kind of, like we've seen in Nubian Square, we want to transfer kind of at moderate income like issue. And I guess to me, widening the category a bit makes sense, to just, again, make sure everything we're thinking about is captured, with the caveat that I think we've all been really clear that we're not trying to apply this to kind of development projects that might, if we get a development project up to 20% on IDP, we're not trying to have them fall into this. So I think it's important that it's up in that category where it's only happening with affordable housing support assistance. But frankly, everything that's more than half affordable housing is totally infeasible without a bunch of that type of financial support. So appreciate that. And then I wondered if you could just expand a bit, because I think that the main challenge that I'm hearing from my colleagues, I think you sort of addressed in your comments about D&D scrutiny, but you know, I think it's really important to specify that there is a difference, to Councillor Edwards and Councillor Flynn's point, and Councillor Baker's. There is a difference between having a legal parking minimum that creates a hook for, you need ZBA relief, and then someone can sue and say, oh, they shouldn't have given this, versus the fact that in our normal review process, we, the city agencies and the community, frequently, you know, say that we think a development needs something and don't support it passing until it has that. So I think like there could well be plenty, and I would fully expect there to be lots of affordable housing projects approved after we make this change, with plenty of parking that's been allocated based on the need. But the difference is, are we creating that legal hook for a lawsuit? And there are lots of things that we vet in Article 80 that people don't need specific zoning relief to do. And we have historically put parking in this special category. And I think we're seeing the proofs in the pudding. It's creating a real problem. And I just want to stress, like, everyone talks about supportive housing and how we need more of it, and how we need more of it to like face the mass and cast. And like, we do, it's expensive. And then the idea that when you line up the resources like Pine Street and TCB did for that development in Councillor O'Malley's district, which frankly is an alignment of the stars, and it's something we need to be doing at much greater volume, and where really the tenant profile comes with very few cars. It just does. Everybody know, like, the idea that then you would be set up for this kind of a lawsuit, I think is just very counter to our policy goals. So I don't know, Jessica, if you could speak a little bit and then I'll stop, but just a little bit more to that point of like, us taking this off the table as a way for someone to sue projects would not mean that you guys would then look at every affordable housing project and say, oh, we don't want parking in affordable housing projects anymore. Is that fair?
Yes, that's what I was trying to bring up, and you're right with my third point, wasn't maybe as specific, but one of the things that I'm really proud of about working at D&D is that I think that D&D has a long commitment on behalf of the administration of partnering with community groups, certainly in the case where we own city land, and also in terms of our expectations of developers if they seek city funding, to really make sure that there has been a thorough community engagement process around a specific individual development. And of course, we also are very closely partnered with BPDA's permitting process and any other agencies' regulatory processes to make sure that our projects are fully compliant, but not just compliant, but also reflective of, you know, what's that neighborhood, who is the project going to be housing, and what are the services those people are going to be receiving. So, you know, in the case of a Pine Street project or a senior project, we're going to be working really closely with the developer to understand what's that population, what's their likely parking need, what has their parking need been in similar projects that we've seen in other places in the city. We also have staff at D&D that do a pretty extensive design review of projects, and parking is an important part of that conversation. So as you're saying, you know, regardless of what happened in a specific zoning change, I don't think D&D would have any intention of changing that iterative process of working with neighborhoods and developers together to understand both what a neighborhood needs and also what a specific development needs in terms of the potential population of that future development.
Great, thanks. And so I just say, Madam Chair, I mean, I obviously need to see them in writing, but the first two suggestions from D&D for me seem like friendly amendments. So thank you.
Just confirming then to Councilor O'Malley as well, you both find the amendments to be
Oh, yes,
acceptable?
without a
Just-
doubt.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Councilor O'Malley.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Briefly, agree with many of the sentiments by the previous speaker, and obviously thank you, Jessica, for your great work and partnership, and look forward to crafting something that's even better. And again, I appreciate the concern, and like every district councilor, and we know you're feeling it acutely, particularly in East Boston, Councilor Chair Edwards. There's no shortage of development in District 6. We're seeing it, the impact, and certainly parking is a huge issue everywhere. And again, what we're talking about, what we seek to do here isn't make it easier for a developer to be able to build more units or cram more into his or her lot to maximize their profits, but to look at a very narrow group of potential developers that would fall under this category. Again, 100% affordable, looking at senior housing as we've seen here. And we're also at the point with these two specific projects that I'm the most familiar with on Washington Street and Jamaica Plain, we had vociferous neighborhood support across the board. And these are many neighborhood groups that often would cite parking as concerns in other for-profit development or mixed use or market rate development. So I just don't want us to conflate the two issues that, yes, we need to be real about parking, that people in Boston have cars, and the impact of increased density and development will impact streets and side streets, with the fact that there are certain projects that do require less cars. And that's why you're having a movement across the country of many municipalities waiving and lowering the parking requirements in all development. We're talking about a very, very small section, which is why I think that this is not only needed and acceptable, but quite frankly, this is something that's warranted. And we've seen now parking being used to prevent progress and to prevent housing many vulnerable Bostonians. So I appreciate the concern that's been raised by you, Madam Chair, and virtually every other councilor. I don't disagree with it. I just don't want us to conflate the issues of what we're trying to do here with larger issues as it relates to parking and development. So happy to continue that conversation. And I know perhaps there's some more thoughts we can hear from members of the public and other members of the administration.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn? You may have gone. Councilor Mejia? Councilor Mejia? Just for folks to know, there's another hearing that's also going on with regards to the ZBA reform at the State House. So myself and other councilors, we might be in between the two testifying. So I'm assuming my fellow councilors are fighting the good fight, maybe in the State House. Councilor, I don't know if Councilor Baker's still with us.
I don't think so, Madam Chair.
Okay. So I will just go into some of my questions and just making sure I'm clear about my understanding. If the goal of this is to really just prevent frivolous lawsuits, then that's one thing. But I don't feel that that's the overall goal and what some advocates are going to be testifying, which is that they just want to have less parking in the city of Boston, right? And that this is whatever you do with parking. I just wanted to also be clear. We're not fixing the too many car problem with this either, right? So I think for those people who are parking advocates, this will become a bargaining chit and something that they point to as an example of the city not planning for the practical realities of people who live here. I think that they'll be able to point to this. I also, while I appreciate that this is removing potentially a legal standard and hopefully preventing someone from blocking an entire affordable unit and building, which I don't think anyone could challenge my heart or my dedication to affordable housing or wanting to have it. I am concerned that if that there's got to be a better way to be able to remove that legal standard and not signal to developers, you don't have to build parking for poor people. Which is my other concern too. I know, and maybe the robust standards and the back and forth for some of your neighborhoods is maybe just stronger than East Boston's. But we have found that too many times the financial interests of developers overruns and runs roughshod over the practical realities and necessities of the neighborhood. So when you take this out, and while I again, maybe it's just us in East Boston having the hardest time fighting to get developers to do what we say, but you take this out and no parking does happen in an affordable, 100% affordable building. Not only should the folks of East Boston fire me as a district councilor for letting that happen, but also I think that there's going to be a genuine concern that we are not only about equity, but that this is a signal to developers of what you can get away with. So there's the legal concerns, there's the practical realities, and then there's what developers, what they will do, which is anything to make money. So let's be clear about that. I believe in the goal of preventing frivolous lawsuits. I wonder if there's got to be a way where you bake into something with this, that there's other obligations that must be then put in on behalf of the developers. If they choose to build no parking, then you must do blah, blah, and blah, and blah, and blah, and blah. And it shouldn't just be based on every single neighborhood to not negotiate that standard, that replacement standard, because it depends on how robust and how strong and how resourced your neighborhood is to be able to fight it back. So I think it would be great if DND or BDD could come up with that standard. If there is going to be 100% affordable building or building that does not have any parking, what is it that we're going to require from developers to provide in place of that? The TAPA agreement needs to involve minimums of, and then put that in there. You're paying for public transportation for the entire building, or your building is located within a quarter-mile walking distance of public transportation. There's just got to be something that you fill in the gap, or you are sure that their gap will be filled in. So I'm not comfortable with this as it is, and I'm being totally transparent about that. So we can go over to advocates if you'd like, or we can go back and forth, Councilor Bach. It's up to you.
Madam Chair, do you mind if I say a word and then maybe we go to the advocates?
Always, please, my dear, go ahead.
So I think I just want to raise a couple of things. Definitely, I think that the last point you made about tapas and kind of, us needing to say
shuttles, there's a whole, list that we can come up with, right?
So I think that the point, I think in general, BTD in general is moving in the direction of asking more folks to kind of say, how are we going to get people access to blue bikes and transit and all of that? And how are you supporting that? I think that's important. I think it's worth underscoring though, that we are talking about affordable housing. And when we save money on affordable housing by, for instance, not building structured parking, the number one thing that we're trying to achieve there is funding to build more affordable units, right? Like that's the thing we're trying to achieve. And that's where, to me, this is a very different conversation than if we were talking about removing parking minimums in market development. And I think it's important, I hear you on what does the equity look like of, we're not saying that we need parking for low-income people, but what we've just seen, when you take the Wales Street example, which was a denial at the ZBA, that was a case of saying low-income people can't have housing here because you're not providing the parking, right? So to me, there's like a much deeper equity issue in terms of who are we creating a home for in the city when parking minimums are ending up as a reason that we are not greenlighting affordable housing. And that really, I think, is cutting at the heart of keeping low-income people in the city. So I just really want to underscore that point. And so I think, to me, like we're not gonna widen the aperture for how many affordable units actually get built in the city without trying to undo some of these things that are used as blocks. And so, and one thing I'll stop now because we do have the advocates, and I know that at least I think Pat Flaherty, who will be on the panel for Mission Hill NHS in my district, can speak to the way that these parking minimums really can and have had negative outcomes on affordable housing development, and the way that they can just make it really hard for things to pencil out. And I think NHS and there are many similar organizations have a strong track record of providing housing that does provide the needed parking for folks who rely on it, but but are also just trying to make sure more of our folks can stay in the neighborhood. So that would be my perspective on that.
And I appreciate that. I hope some of the advocates who are testifying are testifying on from neighborhoods that are dealing with the displacement crisis, that are dealing with the back and forth and the intense the tension, honestly, over building more and not providing parking, right? That's a tension that's overall happening, but the amount of having density and then not enough parking to back it up. And that is what is happening throughout. And I think that I'm hoping that there is someone who can help with that, because I am telling you, my neighborhood is on fire on this issue. And so I am telling you as a district, as a colleague, as a district counselor, maybe you are not dealing with this, but it's gasoline for me. And so when I say my colleagues, my district should easily fire me if this goes this way, I am telling you also about the practical political implications in my district. So I'm not dismissing this. I'm just being totally transparent about it. So I'll turn it over now to the advocate.
Madam Chair, I just had a
Let me
text
just,
with an issue
I'm
with
sorry,
the-
Kenzie, Lydia, just sorry, the live stream has gone out. I've gotten 2 texts from folks, so I didn't know if maybe Carrie could help us with that, but I think we're having some difficulty broadcasting.
Carrie, any word on that?
Working on it. It should be restored in a few seconds.
Okay. We've also been joined by Councilor Braden. Councilor Braden, once we get restored, if you want to do some very brief opening hello, and then we're going to go to advocates.
Thank you.
1 second, let's just confirm we're all restored. Carrie?
We're back online, Madam Chair.
Perfect. So let's turn it over to Councilor Braden, brief hello, and then we're going to turn it over to your first panel, Councilor Bach.
Thank you. I apologize. I had another meeting. This is a very important issue. I echo Councillor Edwards' concerns in our district, and I look forward to hearing what folks have to say. And I think this is the beginning of the conversation. I think we need to get into the weeds a little more going forward, but I'm interested to hear what the advocates have to say. It's a very fine balance between the needs of the community and then the developers will always want to build less anyway, no matter what the project, less parking. So I look forward to hearing what the advocates have to say. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and call up the first panel. For some reason, I don't have a list. So if Councilor Bach, if you want to list the first panel of individuals, I'm going to just don't have that.
Yeah, so if you could, Jesse should come over, Patricia Flaherty, Richard Giordano, 1 second, Kendall Feynman, Andy Waxman. Yeah, so we've got Andy's joining us from the Community Builders, Jesse from B'nai B'rith Housing and Abundant Housing MA, Kendall from Housing Forward Mass, Pat Flaherty, like I mentioned, from Mission Hill Neighborhood Housing Services, and Rich Giordano from the Fenway CDC.
Okay. All right. So we'll go ahead and start with, I think you said Jesse first. So we'll just go ahead and start with Jesse.
I was actually, if you don't mind starting with Andy, that'd be great.
Very well. Andy?
Andy, you there?
Sorry about that, just getting my technology lined up. So I'm Andy Waxman. I'm with the Community Builders. We are partnering with the Pine Street Inn on one of the projects that was mentioned, 3368 Washington Street. And we very much appreciate the positive comments that Councilor O'Malley and others have mentioned about the process. And we are very proud of the 99-point-something% consensus that we achieved on that. I very much agree on the overall goal of limiting frivolous lawsuits and expediting affordable housing development. Certainly our project was delayed unnecessarily, and it's very positive that the council is looking at public policy change to expedite projects like 3368 Washington Street. I hope I'm being correct in this, in what I'm about to say, but my worry here is that this proposed change wouldn't actually create the desired impact of limiting frivolous lawsuits. And I say this with full acknowledgement that I am not a lawyer, but I did learn a good amount about zoning law going through the lawsuit at 3368 Washington Street. And I guess the technical point that it's important to mention about 3368 Washington Street is that we didn't actually seek a variance related to parking minimums. As people have mentioned, the parking are already under the zoning process that's set in the Article 80 process. We certainly, the proposal that we had did have parking, and there was a lot of work that we did and others did about, the track record of how much parking on other Pine Street Inn projects is actually used. So that was all really more part of the Article 80 process. And as I understand it, at least as a technical matter, the parking minimums was not technically challenged in court. We did have to seek variances related to a number of different items: floor area ratio, the height of the building, and even the use. And these were all challenged. The site is currently zoned for light industrial use, and it only allows for 1 story and a fairly low floor area ratio. So my non-lawyer understanding of this is that even if the minimum parking requirement is removed, somebody could still, at least at this site, because of the underlying zoning, somebody could still sue up the project related to floor area ratio or height, even or the use, even if there's not a minimum parking requirement. So for so many reasons that people have mentioned, I fully support these kinds of changes and the idea of limiting frivolous lawsuits, because parking certainly is expensive, and all the issues that people mentioned about balancing equity parking for people in low-income housing with the expense of building that parking. These are all tough issues that we struggle with on this project and on others. But I guess I just want to ask the question: does this change actually help solve the problem of getting rid of these kind of frivolous lawsuits? And I'm again, not being a lawyer, I don't exactly know, but my worry is that it will not solve that problem. Thank you.
Thank you. If it's okay, we have a question from the panel that's really helpful, but if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to another panelist, but we will keep that question up there for the co-sponsors to answer. So I think it was Patricia and then Jesse, or Jesse and then Patricia. Which one do you prefer, Councilor Bach? Do you have a?
Well, you said Pat first, so go to Pat. And then
Pat.
Pat, you're muted still.
Sorry about that. My name is Pat Flaherty. I live on Calumet Street in Mission Hill, and I'm the Executive Director of Mission Hill Neighborhood Housing Services, which is the community development corporation in Mission Hill, working here since 1974. I personally have been working on affordable housing in Mission Hill for almost 40 years, which is a bit scary to me. And I just want to say it's not getting any easier to build affordable housing in the city of Boston. And just to some of the other comments made, we also are very active in looking at mitigations and impacts for private development and institutional development in our neighborhood. So we definitely have those impacts. Don't think there's any neighborhood that doesn't, but we clearly have traffic and parking impacts in Mission Hill. That being said, while many people here are speaking to the issue of the zoning requirement used to stop or halt affordable housing parking in particular, I'd like to look at this a little bit more broadly and talk about cost and constructability. It's not getting easier to build housing in the city of Boston. If we all say that it is a priority for us to provide affordable housing units, then we have to get creative and we have to take affordable housing development out of the broader development framework, in my opinion. I'm lucky to live in a neighborhood that still supports affordable housing, that plans for affordable housing, that sees affordable housing as a stabilizer in our neighborhood. In fact, Mission Hill's diversity, racial, cultural, language, economic, is all owed to the fact that we have affordable housing in our neighborhood that we built over many years. The truth is that's where our families live. We don't have families in market rate housing for the most part in Mission Hill. We have families in our affordable housing. And we were lucky at one point to have large swaths of land and worked with the city of Boston on disposition of properties to build affordable housing. City land was tremendous in helping affordable housing be affordable. But that is not our reality anymore. We now have to compete for market rate opportunities in our neighborhood. Acquisition is extremely high. Site conditions are extremely difficult. Topography, ledge, more ledge, environmental issues that are remnants of previous destruction left for us to clean as part of affordable housing development budgets. It's extremely expensive just to get out of the ground on affordable housing projects. Surface lots for parking are temporary, they're bad urban design, and they're a poor use of our scarce resource. Structured or underground parking that many of us have been struggling to make happen as part of affordable housing projects are, and often to meet antiquated parking requirements if we look at what the needs are for affordable housing projects. Even at very TOD sites like the ones we do in Mission Hill, it means millions with an S are going to create places to park cars rather than places to house a family or house a senior. And we are often constrained on our total unit counts based upon what we can fit on a site related to parking or what we can afford to build related to parking spaces. So parking spaces are literally driving the unit counts in many affordable housing projects still. So we need to get more creative. I see this as a great opportunity to start the discussion across the board on ways we can make affordable housing development different from market rate housing development and speed up production and produce more units of housing. I think this order is an important opportunity to rethink and truly prioritize affordable housing production in our city. And granted, it needs to be balanced with equity and accessibility and other forms of or other modes of transportation that need to be linked to these affordable housing projects. But I think this is a wonderful first step to look at how are we looking at affordable housing differently and allowing for more units to be produced in a quicker period of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Edwards, you're muted, but did you mean to call on Jesse?
Yeah, I said thank you. I'm sorry, and Jesse.
Thank you, Chairwoman Edwards and councilors for this opportunity to speak. My name is Jesse Kanson-Benanav. I'm the Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts, a statewide pro-housing coalition. Just to clarify, comment that Councillor Bach made, I'm no longer with B'nai B'rith Housing, although I'm proud to have spent a number of years before this role working for B'nai B'rith Housing and other nonprofit developers in and around the city of Boston. So I speak to this both as an advocate and someone with background in affordable housing development. I want to thank Councilors Bach and O'Malley for continuing to dig into this important issue of around the permitting, appeals, and construction of 100% affordable housing in all neighborhoods of Boston in order to achieve the vision of a progressive, equitable, and sustainable city. We have to align our municipal ordinances with our vision and values, and I believe this is an important step in that direction. I think this is a strong policy as it is drafted. The resolution sort of gets at the important points, recognizing that failure of permitting construction in Boston by variance leaves 100% affordable housing developments open to appeals. And I agree that parking has been weaponized against affordable housing, as has already been stated today. And that research has demonstrated both locally in greater Boston, around the country, that new parking that's developed is underutilized and is exactly the case in affordable housing. I want to address some of the things that I've heard, and then I'll get to my other comments. I think it's very important to state that eliminating parking minimums doesn't mean developers can't build parking. And certainly, I believe it was Councilor Baker earlier who talked about, well, if they have the space, they should do it. And affordable housing developers take into account a variety of calculations in designing their projects, including marketability, their ability to attract the residents that they need for their development. So for instance, if their target market is families and they recognize that families in a certain neighborhood are only going to apply to live in their building because if there's parking included, or if they do the calculation that their permitting and negotiations with abutters or neighbors is going to go more smoothly, they won't do zero parking. And eliminating parking minimums just eliminates the requirement that's often cumbersome, and as other panelists have said, limits the total number of units. And so this doesn't mean that no new off-street parking will be built in the city of Boston. Also, just, we like to, throw mud at the developers, and I've heard that in this conversation. We're talking about primarily affordable, as the resolution order stated, 100% affordable housing development. For the most part in the city of Boston, 100% affordable housing is developed by nonprofits, by community development corporations, or regional nonprofits or national nonprofits like the community builders or POA. And, their fees, they're not driven by profit. Their fees, developer fees, are closely regulated by Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development and the Department of Neighborhood Development. So, I think this concern about the developers of primarily affordable housing being driven by profits is misplaced. I think is confusing the issue. One thing I wanted to state about the order, and I think this gets to the conversation that I've heard today around frivolous lawsuits. I know the policy order mentions the housing choice law passed earlier this year, which gives judges the option to impose a $50,000 bond when abutters are appealing zoning decisions. Just to be clear, housing choice does not apply to the city of Boston, which is not governed by Mass General Law 40A. I'm not an attorney, so I just want to make that clear. But like Andy, I'm a trained urban planner, and I have some experience with zoning. Section 11 of Boston's own zoning enabling does allow judges in housing or city court to impose a $25,000 bond in appeal cases. However, that does not align with the requirement or the allowance, I guess I should say, in the rest of the state, which allows a $50,000 bond in such appeals in the other 350 cities and towns outside of Boston. Given the impact of appeals against affordable housing development here in the city of Boston, which is among the highest costs of construction in the entire Commonwealth or all of New England, really, and much of the East Coast, I think we should have another conversation. I know today is not looking into this, but we should consider bringing the Boston ordinance in line with the rest of the state, increasing that bond requirement when abutters are appealing, and thinking about how to formalize it and not just leave it at judges' discretion. So that's just an aside. Getting back to the issue at hand, certainly eliminating parking minimums for 100% affordable housing across the city of Boston will help expedite the construction of new affordable homes by reducing abutters' opportunity to appeal. But reducing parking minimums for affordable housing may also help us get more affordable homes built in our neighborhoods, help stem that displacement that we're seeing across the city. And this is because the cost of construction, as the previous panelist talked about, the cost of constructing parking, surface level parking, structure parking, or underground parking is a significant development cost. And depending on the type of parking, it could range, I don't know, maybe anywhere from $40,000 or $50,000 per space for surface parking to much higher for structured parking. So even on the lower end of that scale, we're talking that the cost of building a parking space is maybe a tenth or more of the cost of a single unit. I would ask us today, what is more important and lives up to our values of building an equitable and sustainable city of Boston? One additional home for a low-income family in a new development, or 10 off-street storage spaces for private vehicles? I would say unequivocally, affordable homes are more important. I would also, and I guess this gets back to the conversation earlier with D&D and BPDA, I would encourage us to think about how mixed income or IDP projects play into sort of zoning change to reduce parking minimums. Just as building private vehicle storage spaces is a cost that reduces the total number of units that can go into 100% affordable housing, so too it might have a similar impact on the number of affordable units in IDP or mixed income developments. So with this type of policy change, I believe we should also consider reducing parking minimums for mixed income projects, potentially if the developers can demonstrate that they'll use the savings directly to increase the total number of affordable units in their development above and beyond IDP. And this isn't just theoretical. We have a great example of a sustainable, transit-oriented, mixed income development that was just approved by BBDA at 4198 Washington Street that is building over 3 times the number of affordable units required under IDP. This is 4198 Washington Street in Rosendale. And you know, they're able to build over 3 times the number of affordable homes in this mixed income project, in part because they include no off-street parking in this highly transit area. So I just hope that the arbitrary nature of ZBA decisions in recent years doesn't kill this project moving forward. Finally, I do, want to just encourage the council to not consider this conversation and future action or policy change on the order at hand to be the end of the conversation. I know there is great concern around parking across the city, and we've heard that from Councilor Edwards, and I take that to heart. I would state that if we truly want to be a sustainable, carbon neutral city, we must grapple with the impact that our transportation infrastructure has on our carbon emissions. Key to that is reducing or disincentivizing the use of private vehicles across the city. By maintaining off-street vehicle storage in any development, even primarily market rate housing, we are simply exacerbating our #1 source of fossil fuel emissions in Boston, which is transportation. So from an equity standpoint, we are much more likely to get more affordable housing units if we eliminate parking minimums in all housing construction. And research has shown this. The Furman Center at NYU has demonstrated that reducing parking minimums for all new housing makes construction of new housing more affordable, and that savings is passed on to future renters and owners in the form of reduced housing costs. So I recognize this is a broader conversation. Today we're talking about the policy at hand, I just think it's important to make sure that this is a broader conversation as well after we take this immediate action. I wanted to just add that I've been working with a coalition I live in Jamaica Plain, working with an informal coalition of other Jamaica Plain residents and organizations, including organizations like City Light Beat Urbana, who are supporting the JPNDC senior housing project at Washington Street and trying to push back on Turtle Swamp and their landlord from their frivolous lawsuit against this critical project for our community, which is being opposed and faces a tough road ahead and might not happen because of the weaponization of parking against affordable housing in Boston. So this is something that I have seen in my own community as well as in my work. So I just wanted to close with that. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you. I just want to recognize we were joined by Councilor Flaherty. He may have stepped away, and we also been joined by Councilor Arroyo. Councilor Flaherty, if you're still here, any brief remarks? And if you're not, I understand he had joined us a while ago and 2 speakers ago, and I failed to mention that. Councilor Arroyo, if you wanted to quickly say hello, and then we're going to go on with the panelists.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll make it very brief. I'm just here to say that I do support this initiative. We've had projects in District 5, most recently one on city parking, municipal parking lot, where it was 100% affordable, and the issue was a handful of parking spaces would be lost, and that project ended up not going forward. And when I say handful, I literally mean a handful. And so these are issues that we have in a city where people are being priced out. That impact is disproportionate when it comes to neighborhoods and communities of color. And if we're going to really be serious about that, we're going to have to do some things that may seem politically onerous, like removing parking requirements from affordable housing. But I don't know how else we do this if we don't get serious about making it easier and more affordable to do this process, because frankly, there's not a huge rush. I fight with every developer who comes into my district about how much affordable housing they're going to put in. I think that's something shared by almost every counselor here who's a district counselor, where we have set standards that we have way beyond the city of what we expect these projects to be. And always the comeback is parking, the cost of parking, the length of time for this process, and how much that adds to the bill. And so if there's ways for us to sort of alleviate that process to get more affordable housing, I think that's a win for the city. And I would see that as a win for as a counselor in what I want to see happen with my district and the creation of affordable housing where people from this community can live in this community and continue to live in this community. So thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the makers, Councilor O'Malley and Councilor Bach, for bringing this forward.
Thank you. So I think, let's see, if I'm sorry, I must have missed somebody else on the Jim. There was a Jim Fitzgerald.
No, Kendall.
Sorry. Kendall.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kendall Feynman. I am here today with the nonprofit Housing Forward MA, but so excited to be back in this new capacity and seeing lots of familiar faces. The discussion today has been great so far. A lot of wonderful points have been made, so I'm not going to belabor too much, but I will briefly just say that we are very supportive of this initiative. As a nonprofit research and education organization focused on providing data-backed policy solutions to reducing the Commonwealth's housing shortage, we support the removal of unnecessary obstacles and costs that hinder the creation of affordable workforce housing. Across markets and housing types, mandatory parking minimums have proven to be a significant barrier and artificial constraint that increases the cost of housing, disproportionately affecting middle and low income households. An abundance of research proves how municipal parking requirements inflate the costs of new homes and create an excess supply of parking compared to actual demand. One study from 2016 found that the cost of garage parking increases a household's rent by approximately 17%, whether or not the tenant owns a car. Another report released earlier this year found that current parking practices are comparable to about a 10 to 15% tax on new development. And this number can be much higher in areas with high land costs, like Greater Boston, and have a greater negative impact on the development of lower priced affordable housing. And I know this has kind of been one of the crux of the discussions today, and I just want to also kind of build on what has already been said, that it's important to remember that reducing or eliminating mandatory parking minimums does not eliminate parking. On the other hand, it allows the parking ratio to be determined by the context of a project and the actual demand of those who will live there. With a move toward active transportation and the rise of shared mobility options, new homes often end up with fewer parking spaces than the outdated mandatory minimums require, but at the expense of a costly variance process and the potential for further appeals. While those who live near a proposed project should have a voice in the future of their neighborhood, our city's laws and processes should not allow a well-resourced small group or individual special veto privileges, especially in the context of much needed affordable development. We really thank Councilors O'Malley, Councilor Bach for bringing this forward, for acting so quickly after we've all seen over the last couple of months how parking minimums are being used in the courts. There's a lot of other cities and towns across the country and Massachusetts who are re-examining their parking minimums. I mean, just to say that I know we're not the same as other cities and towns, but it's always good to learn from what's being done elsewhere and to see the outcomes. I know Buffalo, New York, 2 or 3 years ago reduced all parking minimums, and there's some new data coming out from there of what happened. Some housing projects actually had more than the former required minimums based on where they were, but they're definitely seeing a lot less in transit-oriented places, and it's kind of showing how it plays out where context can be brought into the discussion of each project. Yeah, that's all I have for you guys. I'm happy to answer questions, happy to go in any of this deeper, but I didn't want to take too much time. I'm pretty aligned with the folks who've already spoken. So thank you all for having us participate.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendall. I'm going to take the chair for a minute from Councilor Edwards. I'll go to colleagues for questions and comments. I think I'll just quickly say on my own behalf to answer Andy's question. So although the the lawsuit was not hung on the parking for the Pine Street and TCB project. That is one of the core variances that's an issue in the lawsuit now around the corner for the elderly development in Councillor O'Malley's district. And it was the basis for the ZBA rejection of the home for 23 formerly homeless families at Wales Street. And I think also, obviously with the TCB Pine Street lawsuit, although the hook was different, the goal was very much, as trying to get more parking secured. And I think just trying to shift the conversation into a world where that's not one of the things that we hold affordable developments hostage over. I think it's important to kind of shifting that conversation, but I do appreciate you raising that. And I'll just say, my office will share with everybody, because I'm sure we'll have continuing conversation about this, some work that Councilor O'Malley's office and mine did to look at, to Kendall's last point, some of the comparisons of other cities around the country. So Cambridge across the river from us just did no parking minimums for their affordable housing overlay projects. LA is providing parking relief depending on the type of housing, affordability, and proximity to transit. Seattle's eliminated parking requirements for all nonprofit affordable housing developments. Portland has eliminated them for new affordable housing near transit. New York has also eliminated them for pretty much everywhere in the city. And then there's a number, as has been alluded to, there's actually a number of cities that have done much more dramatic things with their parking minimums across the board, not connected to affordable housing. So there's a form of kind of eliminating or dramatically reducing parking minimums that has happened or is happening right now in Minneapolis, Seabrook, New Hampshire, Hartford, Connecticut, Hudson, New York, Buffalo, as was mentioned, Berkeley, and San Francisco. And then Austin's got another kind of affordable focused one. So I think what we're proposing is on the more modest end of some of the action that's been happening on this lately. So those would just be some comments from me. Councillor O'Malley, did you have comments or questions for the panel?
No, thank you all for your great advocacy and work in this space. I'm looking at it, between Andy and Jesse, working on so many projects. And of course, Pat Flaherty, one of my favorite people in Boston, working with her in Ward 10 and back of the hill. And Kendall, who served with such incredible distinction for your predecessor, Councillor Bach, for so many years. It's just great to see you all. And thank you for your great work in this space. I have no further questions. Again, I'm very comfortable with our ordinance, obviously, or our rule change, and certainly welcome and value the input from DND. It does sound like some of our colleagues may have some more questions, so I want everyone to get to a comfortable space with this, but I have no further questions to the panel or to my colleagues, so thank you.
Madam Chair, shall I yield the chair back to you?
Yes, please. Thank you. Did Rich testify already?
He did not, but he's going to be back in like 5 minutes. So I think if Councilors Mejia or Arroyo had questions for the existing folks, Rich could just go at the tail end.
Okay, and then I'll go after Councilor Mejia and Arroyo. Councilor Mejia, did you have any questions?
Yes, I do, just a few. These are kind of, these questions are more for the makers, but I'm curious for the input from the administration as well. In a lot of community meetings, people who want to see reduced parking often advocate for things like they would like to see instead like either green space or more affordable units or public space. How are we making sure that the needs of the people who will be occupying these spaces will be able to design a space that works best for them? I know that this conversation is more about how to avoid lawsuits that can come about because of the variance to reduce parking, but I'm curious to know what are we going to do with the space we save by eliminating parking? Have we spoken to affordable housing residents and or developers about how the space may be used? I'm going to Go Boston 2030 found that people who have the lowest incomes in Boston are living in the most car-dependent neighborhoods. I don't think that this should make us put aside tackling an issue like this because we need to find ways to create more demand for public transportation. But we obviously know that doing this ordinance in a vacuum will create problems for the commute of a lot of low-income families. And how do we make sure that we're working with the state and with BTD to create more public transportation options for low-income residents?
Excellent points, Councilor Mejia. Excellent points. Councilor Arroyo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually only have one question that might be easily answered or might not be something we track, but does anybody know whether or not the city tracks how many 100% affordable housing projects the city has ongoing at any given time, or how many have been proposed in a year? Do we have that data?
Councilor, I don't think we do. I believe Councilor Bach mentioned it was maybe 3 at the time of her introducing this home rule.
But Councilor Arroyo wasn't asking about the ones that are being sued over. He's asking about total units, which I think D&D does track. I think maybe Jessica might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, we track how many are permitted monthly, but we could figure out a way to give you a number of how many projects are ongoing in various stages of development, if that would be helpful.
That would, and I'd also be interested if we can get the data on how many of these projects have not happened. So for instance, like the one in my district, how many of these projects have ended up falling through and not reaching completion would be interesting to me as well. I do believe this is something that sort of has an urgency to it, only because I'm in my first term. I now have one project that has been sort of not made it to the finish line. That was a proposal for 100% affordable. And then we just had one on Washington Street that is a minimum of 40%, but trying to reach 100% that has no parking. And so I'm trying to just get a gist of what neighborhoods are seeing sort of a call for 100% affordable housing, or where developers are putting these, and where they're not succeeding or where they are.
Sure. Yeah, I'll figure out a way to put something together. Sometimes the data isn't the best way to tell the story, because different projects take different amounts of time for different reasons, but we'll figure out a way to make sure that you both get some numbers and some description so that we can answer your question.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very, very quickly, I do have some questions. So how are you defining, to the makers, how are you defining 100% affordable? What's the AMI for it?
So do you want me to take that, Madam Chair?
Sure.
So I had originally said everything sort of like IDP limit and below, with the idea being that we would just say that so that however the IDP changes, it would change with. But one of the suggestions I understand from D&D, sorry, my apologies. I think one of the suggestions from D&D is to kind of align that definition more with the like full category of AMIs that D&D funds in affordable projects. So for instance, going up to the 80 and 100 AMI for home ownership and stuff, so that we're not dealing with so limited of a definition in the zoning that that a bunch of things are falling out with it. I think that was one of their suggestions.
And you took that as a friendly amendment?
Yeah, I would take that as a friendly amendment. I think like I said before, the last time someone did this 20 or 30 years ago, they provided a sort of very specific definition that doesn't align now with a bunch of the affordable projects we're doing. So it would seem to me that we would want to avoid being so specific that we're stuck there again in 5 or 10 years.
So right now, then it's 80 to 100% for ownership and 70% for rental average AMIs, right? For affordability. Maybe I should just ask that for D&D. How do you define
yeah, maybe
that's 70%?
So for a rental, our recommendation is that you do it based on our funding sources, and funding sources allow us to go up to 80% AMI for rental and up to 100% for home ownership. And part of the thinking is that would really capture all projects that are technically affordable, and we work with, because it's pretty unlikely that a project would happen without D&D participation at those income levels. And if it did, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing also, but that captures most pretty much all the projects that we work with.
Okay. So there was a, I know it was off tangent, but to answer some of, or at least to counter some of the notes about about some of our carbon net neutral and some of the comments from Jesse. One of the things, I agree, traffic is by far one of the things that adds to it. I would also say looking for parking and circling and driving and the tolling and the consistent and then moving around for that also adds to this. And so my concern is this is yet another example of planning or zoning without seeing and planning for all the effects that come with it. There's congestion that is going to come from reducing certain amounts of parking. We already are dealing with congestion issues. We're dealing with traffic issues. And so, I know BTD is on here, and it would be great if they could, and I know that they are supportive in certain sense of this, but I mean, we have a problem. And so how, to not acknowledge that this doesn't add to that, or to not acknowledge that this could add to that is, well, I'm just not going to let that not be in this space. I agree with you. I don't like people thinking it's parking over housing or housing versus parking. I don't like that narrative. And I think it's, let's be clear. I don't believe for 1 second the person who was suing about parking really cared about parking. I think that person or those entities cared about certain income levels of certain racial diversity being near and around them in larger concentrations. I'm the only one who's saying that, but I think that that's what it was. So removing the parking as a potential lawsuit or potential legal whatever doesn't obviously remove the bigotry or the attempts for someone who's going to file a frivolous lawsuit to block concentrations of lower middle class people of color coming into their neighborhoods. Sorry to keep it so incredibly real. But I'm not going to pretend that this is really a parking versus housing kind of conversation, nor am I going to feel, or nor am I going to like allow people to walk away thinking I'm putting parking over housing. The other, I want to just echo some of the points that Councilor Mejia said, which really hit me, which was so, and I appreciate, the pushback on developers and who's going to be doing this. I will tell you the developers, majority in my district who are doing doing affordable housing aren't doing it as standalone. They're part of mixed, working with private developers or market rate housing in order to get the affordable housing. So I guess my first question is, how would that impact this? The parking minimum wouldn't apply then, right? And I'm just assume they're offsite.
Sorry, it would. So this is not touching parking minimum requirements for buildings that are, in that, like, whether they're 20, 30, 40% affordable. This is not touching those. So
but what if their affordable units are built offsite?
You mean in an all affordable building?
Correct.
Yeah, if it's an all affordable building that's being permitted separately, then this would apply to that.
Right. And so that's my pushback, I think, on Jesse's comments, is though that there's a nonprofit developers who are just doing that building, that they're not part of a larger team of developers, at least on a whole corridor in East Boston or our entire waterfront, that aren't already congesting and already building a bunch of stock market units, honestly, of single family, of studios for $3,000, right? So they're using that to claim that that's the only way you can get 100% affordable building plus whatever LIHTC and so on and so forth down the road. And then this would then say parking minimums are eliminated for just that building. The luxury units still would have to provide parking, right? Is that what we're doing?
Unless, again, I just want to stress, because I know we've mentioned this a few times, but that it's about minimums, right? As opposed to what happens. So the point being, we frequently also give parking variances on market rate unit, right? So it's all a question of what is actually proposed, but you would not apply the parking minimums.
Right? And I think what I'm giving you, like, what is actually happening, not what's proposed, what's happening, what will happen, what does happen right now in East Boston. So I'm giving you that. It's the public-private kind of dance, which is somewhat required, bait and switch for many of us, that allows for a concentration of a density level that usually favors market. And then finally, we're going to get 100% affordable building, right? But this one won't have parking minimums. And that's that lopsidedness that I'm coming down the pike, and it's already happened. I see the results in East Boston. So,
Madam Chair, if I just, so I have it right, are you talking about if there is a mixed use development that in order to hit their 15 or 17 or 20% affordable builds all those units off-site?
Yeah.
So that wouldn't, that, as I understand it, that would not trigger what we're seeking to do here. We had a scenario also on Washington Street. I'm sorry.
Councilor Bach just said it would. That
But
building
not-
being built separate and permitted separately. Still part of the same. Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking about also on Washington Street, Jamaica Plain, we have, and I want to say it's 3,200. I may have the number wrong, which is mostly market rate and mixed use. And then the developers actually worked with DND to buy 2 lots that abutted it and built that were abutters and built their affordable units, deeply affordable, on those sites. So it was almost a campus approach. So I don't think that's what we're talking about here. If it's part of the same overall campus approach.
Yeah, I think to Councillor O'Malley's point, sorry, just to clarify, Madam Chair, I think if it were a situation where they're all being permitted together, but there's 100% affordable building in the mix, like I think that would not qualify because it wouldn't be an 100% project. What I was alluding to was the fact that, as you know, because you sit on the Neighborhood Housing Trust, there is hardly an 100% affordable building built right now that is not converting linkage money or IDP money from market development projects in the city into support for affordable housing. And sometimes those things are directly linked and they're the offsite, right? They're like sort of adjacent to each other or offsite or whatever. Sometimes it's just going through your trust citywide. But obviously in those cases, even though the subsidy is coming from a for-profit development, it is being, the project itself is an affordable development that's being permitted as such. That was the distinction I was trying to make.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because it's what we're finding, for example, it's very clear that the approval of the market rate building in one case in East Boston, right, but the approval of the entire project was dependent on them spending money and making sure that there was an affordable building or affordable units down the street. So the connection is there's a legal connection, there's the zoning connection, there's the actual connection too. Either way, my point is I'm concerned about how this is going to play out in East Boston. I'm also concerned, or have you considered as a friendly amendment, eliminating or at least removing neighborhoods that are going through a citywide planning process and are in an iPod, who are trying to come up with their own zoning and their own parking and their own density standards right now, before eliminating or moving these aspects of the zoning code? So when a person, I'm just curious as to the makers.
I would be concerned with that because that would likely remove Jamaica Plain, particularly Washington Street, which has been under the JP Rocks corridor study, which has been a Herculean task, not yet ratified by the zoning commission. So I would worry that we would literally pass this with that amendment and could omit 2 of the larger incidences which helped get us to this place.
So just the opposite. I would want to remove East Boston and Charlestown to allow for the neighborhoods to have the voice that they've been so keenly denied and are still denied in terms of being able to define what is density, what makes sense. So
I think, Madam Chair, I think it's worthy of further conversation, whether there's like I think, again, the thing that you want to do is a durable zoning amendment, right? Like something that doesn't kind of require finicking and going back. So I think the question, certainly we could talk with Brian and others, in greater detail about, are there ways to say, oh, there's something that would trump this on the neighborhood level? I think at the same time, if you get too finicky like that, it can kind of lose the plot in terms of the overall policy shift, but happy to discuss further. And when you have a moment, I'd love to just make some comments, but happy to wait for you to finish.
Sure. I guess my overall question too would be, is the goal, I mean, there's nothing you can, the smartest person on the planet can't write something so well that it would prevent a frivolous lawsuit. Let's be clear. And I say that as a lawyer, right? So is the real goal of this to just make affordable, to incentivize developers of affordable housing, to just make them more dense and put in more units? Is that the ultimate goal?
I think I think the ultimate goal of this is to make it easier for us to get affordable units built in the city. And that this would do that on a couple of fronts. It would do that on the front, yes, of removing this hook for frivolous lawsuits. It would also do this, as Pat Flaherty alluded to, in terms of like what affordable housing developers could even sort of plan on as they spec things out. And I think there's a difference between our affordable housing developers speccing things out based on, oh, I'm going to be housing this population and I could expect this many accessible units, and so we'll probably need this many parking spaces, versus them pulling up zoning code and saying, oh, I'm going to have a fight on my hand if I don't do this many. And I think that in terms of like neighborhood driven development and thinking about how we house our low income families, seniors, folks who need supportive housing in the city, that we are better served if folks are starting from getting to think in that first way and not that second. So I think that's the overarching goal here.
To encourage planning for affordable housing and make it easier for them to densify and have more units, or no? The reason I brought that up is because I think a couple of the advocates were discussing that and making it just, it's cheaper, you can build more units, so on and so forth.
So I think, I mean, in general, right? I mean, when we talk about, it's funny, like I think densifying has a certain valence for folks, but like obviously when we talk about getting more affordable units in the city of Boston, right? Like density is a measure of numerator over denominator. So like, yes, the goal is in that sense to densify affordable housing. Like I think we want to meet our housing crisis with more units. In some cases, to your point, that might mean an opportunity for folks to build more on site. And I think to Councillor Mejia's question, like we've seen very direct trade-offs. I hear you on not wanting to sort of like, see the back and forth as this trade-off, but there are real dollar and cents trade-offs between, structured parking building just on a per unit basis and building additional units. So in some cases, it might be an opportunity to build an extra couple of units at a site. But in some cases, it's a question of, those 23 units that were not approved on Wales Street are gone. Right. So that's more units in the sense of getting things to the finish line approval wise.
Okay. All right. You wanted to address some things?
Yeah, I think and forgive me, it's a little repetitive. Councillor Edwards, our whole exchange was, I think, cut off of the video earlier. So I'm a little repetitive here, but I just want to stress that, and I will say, I don't think that District 1 is at all the only one experiencing the pressures of traffic and congestion. I think, like Councillor O'Malley said, we all feel that, and it's intense. I only
represent District 1, so I only speak on behalf of my.
I know, but you did assert its superlative status on that. So I'm just saying, I think it's a citywide issue that we face. But what I will say is, I think when we follow things to their logical conclusion, like we all know that we can't stop building affordable housing when we're in a housing crisis because it will add traffic. Like we can't, like then we will like continue to have people unhoused, prices will continue to spiral upwards. And I know that's not the solution that any of us want. So it seems to me like, therefore, in that equation, if you're not going to just cut off more affordable units at the knees, then the place you have to push in that equation is the solutions to congestion, right? And it's that some of the stuff that you brought up about, how are we creating like transit access? I think it's really promising that BTD has started getting people to say, yeah, we'll do blue bikes. Yeah, we'll do transit passes. I also think last mile service, right? Like I know in Alston Brighton, I was on a call last night about the Mission Hill Link, which is the last mile service in Mission Hill, like thinking about how we get people to transit if they don't live near it. These are the key things. I think you and I, Councillor Edwards, speaking of Districts 1 and 8, are strong proponents of the red-blue connector and thinking about how we enable people to get where they need to get more easily. I mean, I am of the opinion that the red-blue connector alone would cut a whole bunch of car trips out, because it would just make a bunch of trips more reasonable for people. So I guess my point is, like, it's true that we're in a congestion crisis and a housing crisis, and they are interlocked. And so I kind of, and I hear you saying, like, we can't pretend that isn't true. And I agree with you that we can't pretend that isn't true. But I also think that when we look at those interlocked things and we say, which of these do we have to solve for? Like, the solution where we tamp down on affordable housing development is an unacceptable solution. So the solution has to be on the congestion, traffic, transit side. And that's where, like, yeah, it's a heavy lift, but we can't, like, our families will remain unhoused if what we do is pause housing until we figure the traffic piece out. So that would just be my 2 cents on that.
Appreciate, and I want to be very clear. I have not said to pause housing or the production of affordable housing in any way, shape, or form for parking. I'm just not going to pretend that this doesn't impact it, and that it doesn't, like, the backlash or whatnot, that maybe I maybe the only one who receives it, who will have it. So I'm bringing things in. I brought up race. I brought up the fact that it was really classist and racist of the person to sue under the guise of parking. I'm talking these real truths, and you will have the same elitism, racism, and so on and so forth, and for whatever fake lawsuit that comes down the pike, because we do not, as a city, we are highly segregated financially, we are highly segregated racially, and anything that looks like a threat to certain segregation or certain isolation of certain communities will be sued upon. I'm the only one saying that. I'm also, like, noting that the people who are also talking about the affordable housing and how much we need of it, I haven't heard from a person in affordable housing in this hearing, or a person of color from I'm sorry, not from affordable housing as an advocate, I mean living in it. To quote our colleague, all means all. And so I pushed back on our transportation advocates before, when they came in wonderfully progressive and all white and talking about what poor people need and what poor Black people especially need, and none of them are here. So I think that there's, and I'm speaking these truths because they matter. It also leads to the validity of really whose needs we're meeting and really whose needs we're studying. And those two different things. I also want to be clear that it is not, I don't believe in the false choice, but I think if you don't come with if we're going to eliminate this, it is because we expect the affordable housing developers to actually make truly affordable housing, which for many of us, we've all heard the 70% is not. 70% AMI is not. My average AMI in East Boston, based on our studies, is 50. We are 70% renters. We cannot afford 70% AMI. So if this is happening under a standard that is not defined, and not defined by the people who will be benefiting from this, that we studied who would benefit from this, if it's not defined by them, if they're not the ones who are going to be part of leading this conversation, then yeah, I'm hella skeptical and concerned that we are talking about logical conclusions instead of practical realities. So I don't want this to be an elite conversation on behalf of poor people. I want them here. I want the affordable families that we're supposedly fighting for to be leading this conversation the next time we have it about this particular home rule petition.
And I think, Madam Chair, I think that's fair. And I think that we can, obviously this was planned as a working session and not a hearing. I think that we can obviously make that happen. I would just say that I think that when we're talking about real people, like, you know, this came out of north of 200 real, like real units that have been threatened just in these 3 developments in the last few months. And we have heard in each of those conversations from folks who are impacted by that. And so I hear you on, you've got to see it in the hearing, and I think that that's fair. But I don't think that these things are theoretical and elite based. I think that, like, we've seen, and we've seen it not just in Boston, all over the region. I mean, MAPC just came out with their report on the number of parking spots that are going unused, but we we've seen it used to exclude families in exactly the way that you want to prevent from happening. So I take the point, but I think we're all actually rowing in the same direction here.
Are there any other remarks?
I think
or-
Rich Giordano's rejoined us.
Okay. Go ahead, Rich.
I'm very sorry for being in and out. I had to jump to another Zoom meeting, and I didn't realize the timing involved. I don't know if you need for the record, Richard Giordano. I work at Fenway CDC. I'm also on the board of 2 other CDCs in Mission Hill. And just a few things about the idea of changing the zoning and the parking restrictions for 100% affordable housing. I can say the reality on the ground in the Fenway is that there's essentially nowhere to park anyway. And the land is so overdeveloped already that it's a different kind of issue. And currently, in fact, we're building, or hopefully soon building, a 27-unit affordable project on a parking lot, which we bought from a for-profit developer. Luckily, we were not challenged for the parking requirement, but it's been a tool for folks who want to block affordable housing for quite some time. And so, it is something that is real and that we need to address. I'm not sure that we know the complete answer for the entire city, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed. And in addition, there is something that, while it's outside the scope of parking, we need to remember, which is that affordable housing projects are often treated by the various city departments as the bandwagon on which they're going to hitch everything else that they want to have happen. So often affordable housing developments are asked to fix the sidewalks within blocks of the project. They're often asked to take on maintenance of parks around them. They're often asked to do a whole bunch of other things. And yet the different departments don't admit that these things all add costs and make it more and more impossible to stay within the development limits that have been set for total development cost by the city and the state. And parking is one of those problems that is created, especially in the Fenway. The only way to do it is underground, which is utterly prohibitive, except for the biggest and wealthiest developers doing obviously market rate housing. So, I realize this is a fairly complex issue, and it plays out differently in different neighborhoods. But I can assure you that in Mission Hill, we've had a history of local people using every available tool to sue and block housing left and right. Fortunately, that's tapered off in the last year or two, but it has delayed dozen or so housing projects, and in fact, it's probably killed 1 or 2 completely. So the reality in some neighborhoods is that the zoning tools, which were meant to regularize and make development reasonable, are also used to stop development in fairly deleterious ways. So, the parking requirements kind of fit into this bigger picture of affordable housing being asked to do more and more, and yet the subsidy system does not admit that, parking being one of them. And then the reality on the ground is that in certain neighborhoods, the parking requirement is used to stop affordable housing. And also in the Fenway, frankly, there is nowhere to go for parking. And everybody knows that. And even with the 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units that we're going to be constructing, that's a given. And mass transit is the assumption. Of course, we are doing subsidies, as I think was recommended earlier, on the blue bikes and on transit passes, which that's a very reasonable trade-off. But, the issue that I think Councilors O'Malley and Bach are addressing still need to be resolved, in that it's this parking situation is tricky, but that there are folks who really want to stop the production of affordable housing, and they do it through this kind of requirement. So it's complicated. I appreciate the time that the council has put into this and all of the issues raised, and I hope further working sessions can sort of figure out a more comprehensive solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that all from the panel, Councillor Bach?
I see that Councillor Arroyo and O'Malley have their hands up, and also I think Pat Flaherty had. Pat, did you want to say something?
No. Sorry. Was that all from the panel?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to turn over to two people who have been raising their hands since the beginning, and give them an opportunity to speak. I don't know. There was Samantha Montano and also Eric Perot. You can each take about 2 minutes. Just introduce yourselves, where you live, and quickly go for your comment. Samantha?
Did I start? Yeah. Hi, Councillor. Thanks for hosting this working session. Hi, Councillor O'Malley, who represents our district, Councillor Bach. I work at a community development corporation in Jamaica Plain, JPNDC. And I think to this point, I appreciate the conversation. From our perspective, we appreciate the conversation around equity. We know that with our family housing developments, there is a need for cars and for parking. A lot of times, because of the lack of investment from the city and the state in public transportation, better roadways, it's just impossible for folks to afford childcare in one part of the city and make their way to the job in another part of the city. And by the virtue of the wages we pay, like that's just where folks are working. They're less likely to have access to daycare if they have families or whatnot in one central location in the way that folks who make more money can. So it really is essential that families have parking. So I don't think that we should eliminate minimums for affordable family housing. Seniors is a whole different story. A lot of our senior developments have like 1 or 2 people who park cars. So like, obviously that's a very different situation. Same thing for folks who are coming out of chronically homeless housing. We have very low parking ratios for those. But I just wanted to speak to that point and say that, I think the biggest problem is on Washington Street with Plan JP Rocks, we haven't codified it. So we haven't created any sort of like strength behind it. And the only 2 affordable housing developments that have developed on that corridor in the last like 5-6 years have been sued. And as Andy said before, theirs wasn't a parking issue, but JPNDC's is a parking issue. And it's kind of something is not making ends meet if the only 2 affordable housing developments in a plan that was supposed to allocate like 3,500 affordable housing units or something are getting sued. And we've clearly failed at that intersection and creating sort of like any teeth behind that plan. So just that I think in my mind, parking is an equity-based issue. In our mind, we would always want to include some sort of parking with family affordable housing just because of the reality of our city. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, really appreciate it. And Eric, about 2 minutes.
Yeah, my name's Eric Harrett, live in Jamaica Plain. I firstly just wanted to push back quickly on a little bit of, firstly, obviously, thank you so much, Kenzie Bach and Matt O'Malley, for hosting this hearing. It's awesome to hear something that is so near and dear to my heart being talked about in such a public capacity. I just wanted to push back a little bit on some numbers from Lydia. 70% AMI is a limit.
If you're going to refer to my colleagues as Councillor.
Councillor O'Malley, Councillor Bach, Councillor Edwards, and thank you for calling the hearing. The bit about 70% AMI is a limit. 70% AMI units have a rent set at 50% AMI. If you were to set the limit at 70% or at 50% AMI, it's likely that most of the people in your district wouldn't be able to live in those units. Anyway, I definitely want to push back strongly on the notion that it is not parking over housing. Everything in city politics, especially when it comes to zoning, is about space. And space, how we set space is about how we set our priorities. If we have said we want affordable housing, and the but includes a list of things that happens to also include parking, it doesn't really matter how you finagle the wording. There are times when you are going to be saying, we are okay with not building these affordable units because we want the parking, first of all. And second of all, there is not a single neighborhood in any thriving city in the world that does not have a parking problem. You cannot address this problem by building more of it. In fact, all you get by building more of it is more people driving into the same neighborhood, bringing more traffic. Yes, I understand the concept that if you could just get to a magical high level of parking that's just enough, maybe you will have so many places to park cars that you won't need to worry about the fact that you have to drive around looking for empty parking spaces. But frankly, I don't even think that's likely to happen, because the parking in the buildings and the parking on the street, they're not even part of the same pool, really. Like, you can build all the parking you want in a building and it will not address your parking on the street. And lastly, just, I feel like it's a little bit weird that as a city council, we're considering the idea that, like, we know better, the city knows better what the needs of the parking needs are of the residents of affordable housing than the very CDCs we've charged with building this stuff and with being experts on the topic. So, we don't require every unit to be a 2-bedroom unit. We don't make them build 2 bathrooms in every unit. And we don't do that, not because people wouldn't value those things, but because it would make the projects prohibitively expensive and limit what could be built. And I think parking is very much of the same vein. Thank you for the time.
And so we'll turn it over now to, I'm sorry, Gianna Tortellini also raised her hand. I don't know if Deanna, if you're still available to testify.
Hi, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Apologies. So I am a resident of South Boston. I have lived here for 9 years. I wish I had more expertise specifically in the topic of affordable housing. I really just wanted to come here and give you my personal opinion about the impact of not providing parking spaces is on the existing residents in a neighborhood. And I know that this bill specifically addresses 100% affordable units exclusively. And I know that that is not the majority of affordable housing in the city. And I don't want to take away at all from the importance of providing affordable housing for people who need it, or the importance of addressing climate change. But we have an extraordinary income inequality problem in this country. And the impact of that is that rather than addressing it at a national level, cities and towns are forced to deal with it on a local level. And so when we try to create more housing in existing overcrowded neighborhoods, where there are already more and more people trying to move into those neighborhoods, the existing residents suffer a degree of quality of life change that creates a lot of resentment and anger in the community. It personally has affected me. I do pay for off-street parking. It is not uncommon for me to come home to park my car because I do provide supplemental elder care, and to find somebody else who is a complete stranger parked in my parking spot. That has happened at times. I have had to go to funerals for coworkers. It has happened at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I've gotten into arguments with people about it. Now, I know that's just anecdotes, that's not data. I did look at the study that was linked in the description of the docket hearing that was performed. And even in that study, the city council is proposing to have 0 parking spots in affordable housing units. But even in that study, I think it was 0.55, so about half of the affordable units actually did have tenants or residents who own cars. So I'm not exactly sure why it is that we're looking to make this a 0 rather than try to come up with something that is more appropriate for the type of affordable housing building, given its proximity to public transit in certain neighborhoods. I certainly don't have problems finding a parking spot if I drive to other neighborhoods in Boston. But in South Boston, it's a real issue. Ed Flynn was on the call earlier today. I've also been listening to what Councillor Edwards has been saying. I am one of the local residents who is, who has the fire lit beneath her to try to do something here to both, enhance affordable housing without making quality of life for the rest of us worse. I don't understand why we need to kill a mosquito with a bazooka. I just think that the proposed amendment is too broad a brush. Like, it can't be for every neighborhood and it can't be across the board. If what the city council is trying to do is address the circumstances that created a frivolous lawsuit, and to Councillor Edwards' point, that lawsuit very may well have been triggered by the demographics of the people that were moving into that affordable unit. There are other options here than just removing parking minimums in entirety. The city council could pass an ordinance that 50% of abutters need to join the lawsuit, or that the property owner needs to prove some sort of, harm done to them. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a legal expert, but to me, that's just, it's too much. And, from day to day living in the city as somebody who wants to stay in South Boston and doesn't want to leave, I'm just really, really concerned that the long-term vision here is more so about, allowing people to live with, greater inconvenience, greater discomfort without a real vision. Like, we're just going to let this get as bad as possible for local residents until eventually people just get rid of their cars. I know that public transit is super important. I would pay higher taxes to support greater expansion of public transit in this city. I would have no problem with that whatsoever. But at the end of the day, these are all still multi-year, potentially multi-decade projects. And people who live in my neighborhood have kids. They also have to provide elder care. They have to transport heavy goods from location A to location B. This idea that affordable housing means that we can't incorporate the cost of parking into it does not in any way take away from the fact that people still need it. And, as much as I absolutely support people who are currently using affordable housing, their lives change. They may have kids. They may need to change their job. They may need to be able to drop a kid off at daycare in one part of the city and then drive to a job in some other part of the city. And, Councillor Edwards was talking about East Boston. I don't go to Eastie that often unless I'm getting pizza, but I will tell you right now, in Southie, circling the block is horrifying. And I'm fortunate enough that I can afford to pay for off-street parking, but I know a lot of people can't. And if you ever go on the South Boston Community Bulletin Board Facebook page, you will see a whole bunch of angry residents in Councillor Flynn's district who have the exact same opinion as me. And I know you're not hearing from them now because it's hard for people to get out of work at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I just don't want this situation to continue because I love this city. I'm really happy with my neighbors and I want people to have a good quality of life here, and continued overcrowding without thoughts to people's quality of life is really concerning to me. And I assume the best motives on the part of all the city councilors. This is a hard thing to talk about, but at the end of the day, people already live here. And I think that this one case with this one developer in Jamaica Plain is a situation of hard cases make bad law. The proposed amendment is too broad. There needs to be greater granularity to it. And I think that the city council can be more innovative than what has been discussed here to try to find solutions, especially if the data that they are referring to in the own study that was commissioned by the city says that people in affordable housing units do have parking spots. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I appreciate this. I'm going to now, the folks who have left to speak, we're about at 2 hours now. So I have Councillor O'Malley, who is the lead sponsor, then followed by Councillor Arroyo, who raised his hand, and then Jesse. I don't know if the councillors would want Jesse to go first, and then we can go reverse order and let Councillor O'Malley conclude with Councillor Block. Okay, then. So Jesse, you'll go first, and then Councillor Arroyo, and then Councillor O'Malley, then Councillor Block. And then we'll
Apologies. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I just wanted to drive home one additional point, or it was a point that I already made, and I think it's relevant to some of the concerns that the previous member of the public mentioned and some counselors have as well. Eliminating parking minimums just eliminates what is potentially an onerous requirement for a developer. It does not prohibit developers from building parking. As I said in my comments now, probably an hour or so ago, developers make a variety of calculations when designing their projects, including the ability to market it to their target residents, their ability to be a good neighbor, because the developers of affordable housing generally maintain ownership of these developments in neighborhoods for years and years and years, as in the case of JPNDC and other CDCs. And so the developers want to build a development. The nonprofit affordable housing developers want to build a project that will work, that will attract the residents that they want to serve. And if, in the case of, let's say, a family development in Jamaica Plain, they realize that they need to include parking, the elimination of parking minimums does not prohibit them from doing this. This ordinance would not eliminate parking from 100% affordable multifamily housing in the city of Boston. It just won't. And that's an important point.
Thank you, Jesse. To Councilor Arroyo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to touch on a number of points, and then I have to head to ABCD speaking engagement. But in terms of a number of valid concerns that the chair brought up, including who is represented here and who's speaking here, I do think that if we're going to tell honest truths about our housing and development process, it's very important that we also acknowledge that our community meetings, our abutter meetings, the folks who engage in these processes don't look like the folks, don't look like me, certainly don't look like you, Madam Chair, and that's a real issue that we face. And I think if we did, we'd notice some different things. And I'll just speak for my own district. The issues that I have had brought forward to me from constituents of color over development in the past 2 years have revolved around environmental concerns, have revolved around health concerns with a Burger King in my district. The vast majority of the time, folks who are bringing up parking, folks who are bringing up the issue of parking do not look like me, do not look like you, Madam Chair, are not from a specific income bracket. And when we're talking about representation in the process, we're missing in that entire process. And I think if we did, you would hear more voices saying, of course, we want more affordable housing, because I think it's really important to understand that you cannot separate that if there is something that is making it impossible or incredibly difficult to create affordable housing, and the reason for that is parking, we are prioritizing cars over homes. That is just how that works, if that's what we're doing with the process. I think there's valid concerns here. I will say my godfather lives in South Boston. He's had serious medical issues. He lives on M Street, right across from the M Street Park. He has serious medical issues over the last 6 years, and I've gone, for instance, during the COVID pandemic to help him with groceries and things of that nature. And I'm very aware of the parking concerns and the parking issues that South Boston has. It can be impossible to find a spot after 8. But what I do think what we're talking about specifically here with affordable housing at 100% level rate, the reality is we need it. We are in a housing crisis, and we also have congestion issues, and we have very real issues with that. And I will just say this is not a Eastie, Southie reliant issue. If you want to come to Rosendale Square and try to go grab something really quick, you'll figure out really quickly that parking is an issue everywhere. In specific parts of Hyde Park, it can be the same. And so from the perspective of, speaking on who has voices and who does not have voices, I will just say that often in my family's history, and this is all anecdotal, I'm sure there's data one way or the other, but driving is incredibly expensive. It's not a cheap venture in the city of Boston with excise taxes. If you want to get into the documentation, and I will just say this is a former public defender, the criminalization of poverty often starts with moving violations and driving in cars like that. And so what we're talking about often is folks who don't have access to vehicles, folks who do have access to vehicles but can't really afford it. They're on the verge of affording that. And if we're trying to create affordable housing, I think the reality is, if we're fighting over parking, yes, some families do need parking. Some folks are going to rely on parking. Some parts of our city, and this is really important to emphasize because it's part of District 5, have real public transportation access issues and inequity issues. That's just real. I don't have a train station as far as the MBTA goes. I have commuter rail stations. I don't have a train station until you get to Forest Hills. And so almost all of my district the entirety of my district goes from buses to these sort of pool places to Forest Hills. And so I'm aware of all the kind of equity issues we have and whether or not somebody can't even exist on my part of town without a vehicle. I think the answer is yes, because they do it right now. And I think the reality is if we're creating housing for them to live in, that they can actually have a home and a stake in the community, that's the only way we're going to do it, because I'm facing rising displacement. I mean, the folks who live in my community will tell you they've been displaced from other communities. Much of my Rosendale community has come from Jamaica Plain. I have a joke at the Rosendale Farmer Market when I see somebody from JP, I say a future resident, because displacement is happening and it's coming to the southern neighborhoods. And the reality is, as we move forward, the only way they're going to be able to, and when I say they, I mean folks within limited incomes in our communities to exist, is if we're creating these kinds of housing. And the reality is, every development project that I have, we're fighting over the parking and the affordable housing percentage. But if we're going to build a house, a development, because it has a certain number of spots and 20 to 25% affordability, I consider it a much bigger win for us as a city if we get much higher percentages of affordability with less parking. And I think most folks would, especially folks who are struggling to hold on to a place and a residence in this city. So thank you. I think those are valid concerns, though, Councilor Edwards. I think there's certain loopholes we can try to make sure we write out. But I do want to just stress that when we fight over parking, over affordable housing, we are fighting over housing a car, over housing a human. And that's just the reality of that. And so I'm going to head off to this thing. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the comments, and thank you for the residents who stayed on to voice their opinions. I know this is something people are passionate about. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Excellent points, Councilor Arroyo. Councilor O'Malley, then I'm going to turn over to Councilor Bach to both will conclude this hearing.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will keep it brief. Appreciate everyone's insights, opinions, thoughts, and life experience. And you know, I just want to be clear here, and this may be a bit repetitive, but what we're talking about here, I don't want us to conflate the very real issue that parking is difficult in the city of Boston. There's no question that the downtown neighborhoods feel it acutely, more acutely than perhaps the outer lying neighborhoods, but we feel it too. There's no question about it. There was a study in the Globe, I believe yesterday, saying that traffic is now returned to pre-pandemic levels. This is a big issue, but we're not talking about, to Jesse Canson Benevid's point, we're not talking about eliminating all parking and all development, or even all 100% development. What we're simply talking about is looking at these really unique situations where parking requirements have been used as a cudgel to prevent progress. So we're talking about quality of life, and that's important. That's what I've been focused on in 11 years as a district city councilor, your quality of life. The predecessor to Councilor Arroyo, Councilor McCarthy, used to say, what happens in front of your front door is what's important to me, meaning him as city councilor. And I think that we all share that. But I'm also concerned about the quality of life of these 200 plus formerly homeless individuals who have had their housing further delayed amid pandemic at a time when it's needed. I'm also concerned about the quality of life of these 30 plus senior citizens, older Bostonians who will be gentrified out, who will be displaced by the high cost of rents that JPNDC has worked with, not only providing a home, a safe, wonderful, thriving home for them, but also two beloved businesses to be able to keep those in the neighborhood. These quality of life have been disregarded under the guise of a frivolous lawsuit. So what Councilor Bach and I are trying to do there, and obviously we recognize there'll be further working session or a further hearing, however the chair and we decide to proceed, and there'll be more conversation on this. But what we're trying to do is really address a problem that is impacting people, and it's growing people. It does not diminish other concerns that have been raised by so many other folks, concerns that I share, that Kenzie shares. We are focused on this, but for what we're specifically trying to do right here as it relates to 100% deeply affordable, far beyond the 70 or 50% AMI, looking at these vulnerable populations, we want to make sure that we're able to provide for them. And quite frankly, work with the great nonprofits, the community builders, Pine Street Inn, JPNDC, Urban Edge, so many others that have been working in the trenches, certainly in my district. We want to be able to work with them to facilitate this housing. And the last asterisk I will say is, once again, as we talk about the community response or the neighborhood's response, and I recognize every neighborhood is different, but on these two specific issues on Washington Street, the senior housing, the formerly homeless or unhoused housing, these were met after lengthy, deliberative, and again, near uniformly positive, almost everyone was in favor of this except one landlord, and that perhaps that's a bit of an overstatement, but suffice it to say, these were incredibly vetted and supported projects, and I'm just going to continue to fight to make sure that we can make it happen, and to make sure that we won't allow for any false tools to be used against them. So appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Councilor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councilors O'Malley and Arroyo have been eloquent, and so I'll keep my remarks brief. I just, I think that I think a lot about the fact that in all conversation, I mean, there's the issue that Councilor Arroyo raised about, who comes to abutter meetings and neighborhood meetings, but with housing specifically, there's this deeper issue of the folks you haven't made a place for yet in your neighborhood can't even get the flyer to ignore or not ignore, right? Like they're not in the mix yet. And the way that we tend to organize our consultations are geographic. And if they live if it's a shelter across town or in Lynn, they're not even in the denominator to come or not to come. And so to me, that's been a really important part of our push together, Madam Chair, thinking about the historical exclusion piece of the firmly furthering fair housing. And I do think it's a important piece here of thinking about how we're smoothing the way for more of those places for people to be made in more of our communities. And to me, there is at some point we don't want people sleeping in their car, so we gotta prioritize building places for them. So I appreciate all of the comments today, and I think obviously we'll work with you, Madam Chair, and think about ways to kind of edit the proposal to adjust for some of those concerns and have further conversation. But I do hope this is something that we can move forward because I think it's needed. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to conclude our conversation today. We will pick it up. I look forward to getting all comments. And again, you can write them to ccc.go@boston.gov. And you can provide additional thoughts or suggestions for this proposed zoning amendment. Thank you.
Thanks.